saw your picture. Will has a class of me right next to the theater. I saw your picture. I was like, what? I wanted to go and attend, but I was because of the business schedule. How's it been going?
It's been going good. So we had our last performance on Saturday, and now we're moving on to the one acts for the theater department. It was, Miracle Work was really fun. I had no lines because I was blinded out, so that was pretty cool. And I had water and grits thrown on me.
Yeah, I heard Maxine told me it was very physical, like a lot of physical stuff.
She had to pick me up in a fireman carry at one point. It was
Did
pretty
you
cool.
hurt yourself at any point? Or no?
No, because we were all padded up. We had knee pads, and then we had like pads, like pad pants and everything like that. So minimal injuries, but she's definitely beaten and bruised.
Yeah, just talk.
Natural byproduct.
You said you went too, right?
On Friday.
Mm-hmm.
Angry, so.
Good. All right, so it's our last week. Friday will be our last class, and so I want everyone here Friday, everyone in attendance, right? So we could kind of talk about other things. Bring some snacks. Feel free, bring something, chips, cookies, all of us to enjoy. I'll bring some stuff too. And we could just kind of be a chill day, kind of like, hey, maybe we'll watch some films or anything anybody can think of could pop up. Have off-topic discussions or on-topic discussions of some sort. I think I put on Blackboard your exam, and I created that submission for your final papers. So you can submit that whenever you are ready. Exam is Monday. I will open it up Monday, and I'll leave it open to maybe Thursday. Okay, so you have plenty of time to get that in. And so yes, this Friday will be our last in-person class. Have you enjoyed the course? Yeah. Interesting. But, you know, I was thinking about how, you know, here we're talking the whole entire course of human sexuality and all these different facets, and related back to just general psychology, right? When we talk about like Freud, Adler, and Carl Jung, behaviorists, and humanists, and those sorts of things. Well, how fundamental sexual life is to the human psyche, right? As we evolve and move on, challenges with our sexuality, our sexual life, sexual health, whether we avoid it or engage, right? Whether we're asexual or promiscuous, it has a significant impact on our total behavior and our total mindsets and mind frames. So something to consider as you kind of correlate it, like, well, why an entire topic of this, right? An entire topic because it's all fundamentally, you know, Freud even, you know, talked about the libido, sex drive, right? Unconsciously, a lot of this deals with repression, right? We are inadequate in some way, and maybe our sex life may be part of that, right? Because sex life involves companionship, intimacy, touching, engagement. Right? We are more pleasure derived, and we seek out to engage in it more than others. Well, ultimately with consequences, right? Too much of anything has consequences. But it's definitely an important facet of human life, right? And human behavior. So something to kind of link in your mind and network between total behavior and sexual behavior, and how important that is. Because the species doesn't continue if there's no reproduction, right? So obviously it must be important to me. Sex work. So we kind of left off talking about like things like pornography and things of that nature, but here we're talking about sex workers. In our minds, we kind of want to differentiate things between, as we saw in the previous chapter, consensual sex versus coercive sex. Right? If we're talking maybe sex workers, but we're referring to a very young age, we can't say that that's sex work. We call that child prostitution. Right? You're being prostituted, you're forced. Because we say you're under the legal age of consent, you can't consent by our definitions of what we require to consent. You're not in the right mental capacity to make sort of logical choices that would avoid detrimental harm to yourself in the long term. Right, so we kind of want to differentiate, but here we're talking about sex work, different types, what are some of the motives and drives and likelihood that one can fall into engaging in sex work, the perspective of the person consuming the sex work, the perspective of the person producing the sex work, what exactly is it, right? So we say sex work is engaging in exchange of sexual activity of any kind, right? For compensation of any kind. So when we think of sex work, what are some forms that you could think of offhand of what sex work is? What are some types of sex work that you could think of offhand?
There's different types,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, we're saying the exchange, right, of production of something, consumption of another, right, this exchange for compensation in any way that elicits some sort of sexual response, pleasure. We can think of coitus, where we're talking about vaginal to penis penetration, but we're saying overall broad concept.
Are you also talking about the difference between like, if we would think of like a brothel, where it's like a house that people go to order it versus a quote unquote like streetwalker, like a prostitute on the street?
Yeah, I mean, it could be all of that. I mean, think of it, like, so is stripping sex work? Yes, they classify, right? It's the production of dancing, right? In order to elicit a sexual response from in exchange for something. So we say quid pro quo. I do this, you give me that, right? If we want to simplify it. What other ways we could think of? Think of modern ways using the internet, all of those. Yeah, absolutely. We say if it's something of a sexual nature being produced on OnlyFans, you're engaging in sex work, right? You're eliciting sexual response for compensation. It's an exchange, right? Anything else you could think of?
Sugar babies.
Well, we say if it's, here with sex work, we say it should be immediately transactional. It can't fall under the sort of umbrella of a relationship, right? Because sometimes relationships, any of them just have agreements. Hey, you stay at home, take care of the house, I go work. I don't know if we could classify that as,
There's also several aspects of it. There's
Yeah.
a almost type of, almost what we call it a bought wife or something, where it's like, I'll financially support you, you just do what I want or whatever. But then there's also to the other side of basically more straight prostitution of like, I will go on dates with you, I will sleep with you, if
Yeah.
you buy me things.
absolutely. We say that will fall under sex work. If there's like a direct, we say very direct, right? A direct, very direct sort of agreement about, I provide this, you give me that, right? But sometimes when it's indirect, and now, you know, it goes for a long period of time, kind of like this is an unspoken thing, but it's just an exchange for something. But so we kind of have it in our mindset, kind of look at the difference. So we say type of sex work are so varied, as are the people who engage in them. Primarily, we may think of women, but there's a lot of men that engage in sex work of some kind, right? They could be male strippers, right? They could be male prostitutes of some kind. Remember, we were just talking about sex trafficking, things of that. We'll get into that. It's a little bit different, but these are consensual, cognitive adults who engage in the practice. The history of prostitution and sex work, right? So we say prostitution, you know, we kind of call it one of the oldest professions of all time, but it's sort of evolved because of certain situations and circumstances. You know, you think maybe historically speaking, in ancient civilizations, there may not have been opportunities for women to get any sort of compensation elsewhere, right? Not have an opportunity to have certain jobs that men could hold, to be able to access resources of some kind, in which case you may call it sort of force, right? Coercion, social coercion, like you're kind of forced by society to engage in such practices, either to take care of your children, your yourself, what have you. Right? It's been long, it's a very long history, it's been tolerated in many civilizations, right? Maybe taboo in others, but throughout most civilizations, it's been tolerated. It's been sort of in common understanding that there are people who demand such things and people who supply such things, right? For which reason? In the modern times, we kind of look at more of the likelihood that someone will fall into the profession and more of a psychological analysis of risk factors and things associated with anxiety, depression, abandonment. So we kind of take a more scientific approach of looking as to why people either purchase it or why people engage in the practice. Legal status of sex work varies from place to place, right? Different areas allow for prostitution, others do not. It could be based on municipality, it could be based on the state, based on the country, things of that nature. I think I have a map here that shows where it's predominantly legal and illegal. This one's a bit. Alright, so here's a global map that kind of shows express legality within the world. We see places in red where it's highly sort of considered illegal. Places where it's sort of neutral, legalized in some way would be here in the United States, around Nevada. Places like Central America, South America, places in Africa, even in India allow it, right, in some legal status, and even lighter sort of shades have various little to no laws regulating it whatsoever, right, just kind of an open sort of aspect of it. All right, decriminalization, removal of all criminal laws related to the sex industry and establishment of occupational health and safety work regulation. Who's all for decriminalizing sex work altogether here in the state? Who thinks we should decriminalize sex work altogether? Who thinks we should just legalize it? Why that versus decriminalization?
Because legalization, I feel like decriminalization, they're just gonna be like, okay, y'all wanted us to not take any legal actions with this, so we're not gonna take any legal action when something happens to you, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas legalization, if there are ways to control it and regulate what's going on within, sex work, then they'll still be protected if anything wrong does happen to the prostitute.
Yeah, you're like, well, in this sort of interaction, anything can take place. We're talking about violence, right? The exchange of sexually transmitted infections, right? All sorts of people being coerced into sex. things can happen. So maybe legalization is a better sort of option than decriminalization. All right, here's a better one. I know what's on there. All right, so worldwide legal status of sex work. All right, here's the opposite. Before it was in red, but in blue it's illegal. Right? In red we say it's legal. So we got it legal in Canada, most of South America, Central America, places in Africa. Europe predominantly legalizes it. Places like Kazakhstan. India and Australia is restricted, not regulated, and Indonesia and parts of Eastern Europe and some parts of Southeastern Africa. Right? So kind of almost a 50-50 split between legal and illegal. All right, adult sex workers vary from one another in characteristics, right? We say critical distinction, why they choose to work. Some people just say it's an economic necessity. They choose to do the type of work for economic purposes. Others, we say they're psychological, social, and environmental factors, particularly issues from childhood, such as sexual trauma from childhood, neglect, abandonment, sort of things that can cause the behavior. Absenteeism in school. Because here we're trying to say what creates vulnerability for one person to engage in such act based on their circumstance or their situation or some form of psychological trauma. Right? Absenteeism from school allows one to be in the outside world, especially as an underage child, right? In which case you're submitting yourself to vulnerable forces out there in which you could be taken, could be manipulated into engaging in the work from an early age. So you say, well, that's really a problem if you engaged in the work before you were an adult, right? Because you say, well, this shouldn't have happened before you were an adult. You weren't consciously aware of the circumstances. Maybe your pimp or your adult friend, as you call it, or someone who's taking care of you is a manipulator, right? And kind of manipulates you into doing other things for them. So we say psychological, social, and environmental factors. Personal choice in the sense of power of control. So some people it's a personal choice. They feel that their sexuality or their ability to engage and produce sex material or sexual engagement is a sense of power and control over themselves and maybe personal over others. Desperation, runaways are also an environmental factor. Right? To say if you're desperate in the world and you need, to sort of supply yourself with necessity of things, one can feel vulnerable to engage in the practice of sex work. Right? Streetwalkers, risk for abuse. Why are they at such a high risk for abuse versus many other forms of prostitution? Yes?
I think just physical, the environment itself does a lot. So in the case of a brothel, it's already a house, right?
Mhm.
You're surrounded by other strippers, there's some kind of, person at the theoretically registered, quote unquote. So safer environment, something goes wrong, you can yell for help, somebody's right there. Streetwalker, you're getting into a car, you're going somewhere else, you are isolated, alone with, also just opened up to the public. So clientele, I'm sure probably is some factors, I don't know how much, but then also I'm sure environment plays a ton into it. And it's just like, in general sense, I think as soon as you open yourself up to the unfiltered public, you get a lot of bad apples.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk about controlled versus uncontrolled environment, right? And a brothel, more of a controlled environment, the expectations could be more predictable. Here you're saying you don't really know what you're gonna get. You might be found out with serial killers, and now you're being taken off in the car or something. But in a brothel, you may have a sense of security, personal space, boundaries, things like that. You'll feel more safe. As we saw, sex work is not only for women, right? Internet sex work, the internet has transformed the profession. Use of independent websites to operate. And we say pornography can also be part of prostitution, right? People could be forced to sort of engage in material or production of material in order to elicit a sexual response or in exchange for something of some kind. Eliminates the needs for pimps and brothels, right? That may be more of the gravitating factor for people to engage into it, right? Sort of streamlines the process, gets away with the middleman, and eliminates security issues that you may have with that pimp or horrible environment with the brothel. Safer and less oppressive working conditions. Right? And then we got laws to assess the laws may have an impact on how sexual services are sold online. So we got our regulation of internet prostitution there too, the regulators. The median age of entry into the sex industry is between ages of 12 and 14. When we say we define a child as 13 years of age or less, so these are primarily children. Still 14 is still under the age of consent. You cannot consent at that age. Right? So it's really you're kind of being coerced into the work in some form or fashion due to the factors we saw: vulnerability, issues at home, being out of school, desperation, right, neglect, all of the above. High correlation between those who engage in sex work and or prostitution and the use of drugs and alcohol. What do you think is the relationship between the two? Or is there a high probability for these groups of individuals to engage in the practice of sex and drug abuse or alcohol?
One, escapism of all the substances tend to dull you, dissociate from the outside world of trauma that they're experiencing. Two, it could be a manipulation tactic by people to get them hooked and addicted to them and keep them
Unconscious.
use the addiction to manipulate them into staying in a circle.
Yeah, you say it could be used to feel the addiction. Drugs are addictive, alcohol as well too. And once again, in order to get those resources, one can manipulate by coercing them to engage in sexual activity in order to fuel the addiction. Right? Two, what was saying, escapism. If you're not happy about this type of work, right, and most are not, we could say, well, it's anxiety, it's stress, it's trauma, and so how do you get away from that and deal with the pain, right? We just substitute the word anxiety for pain. Well, you would engage in things such as alcohol and drugs to allow your mind to deviate from that pain, right, for the time being until you have to engage into the next transaction. Means of survival, have to run away from home. We talked about that. Most are exploited by pimps, can charge higher prices and make more money with younger girls. So I think we'll talk a little bit about sex trafficking, how that all works. You know, places around the world, parents even sell their children into sex work, right, underage. Sex trafficking, I believe, is the second highest product, as we would call it, being sold by international criminal gangs behind drugs. So behind drugs, sex is being sold the most by international criminal gangs. There's some personal costs, right? We say most sex workers across the world operate under the disadvantages of criminal legal statutes, which means they can't really come to the authorities for any sort of issues that they have, probably for being, you know, it being illegal, it being taboo, fear, ostracizing. And then there's some physical and mental health problems developed due to violence, stress, sexually transmitted disease, and lack of control, right? 2/3 meet diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And there's a high degree of those who have HIV or AIDS that engage in this type of work. All right, who are some of the customers of sex workers, right? We call Johns the men who buy sex in one form or another. All backgrounds, ages, races, religions, and socioeconomic statuses engaged in the purchasing of sex work. One study found that 10% had exchanged money for sex in the last 10 months. I think 10% of the men, I'm not sure how large that study was, but 10% of the men had engaged in exchange for money for sex. Women are far less likely to pay for sex, however, female sex tourism has increased, or what we call beach boys.